Britain is already deploying armed drones over Syria, supposedly for surveillance, joining the ones already operating in Iraq. And this despite our government promising there would be no UK involvement in Syria without a parliamentary vote. British troops have also now been freed up for any possible ground campaigns following their departure from Helmand in Afghanistan. So how long before we see a full-on campaign in Iraq and possibly Syria as well? Joining me is former London Mayor Ken Livingstone, a prominent opponent of the 2003 Iraq invasion. Welcome, Ken, to Going Underground. You oppose that invasion. Is this a continuation of the 2003 invasion?
If you go back and read what's now been published from people's diaries and official documents, immediately after 9/11, when Tony Blair arrived at the White House, he was shocked because everyone around George Bush was not talking about Afghanistan and Al-Qaeda, they're talking about Iraq and Saddam Hussein. So it was always a cover.
And this current war?
It's still, ever since basically the end of the First World War, Britain and America have intervened all over the Middle East to control the flow of oil. It's been central to their economy. They put up regimes that were completely corrupt. They overthrew democratically elected ones like in Iran in 1953. We've just had 100 years of Western intervention, and the tragedy is, when you look at the loss of life and what it's cost us, we would have been better off just paying an honest price for the oil and letting the Arab countries actually, sell it themselves.
Not sure what our military contractors would say that about, or their accountants. So, the Labour Party did support this war. You must have been proud of what happened about the Syria vote when the Parliament voted against it. Why then don't your colleagues, former colleagues, understand that?
Well, no. One of the reasons I supported Ed Miliband for Labour leader was because he was coming out quite clearly and saying the invasion of Iraq in 2003 had been a mistake, and his brother wasn't prepared to admit that. And by taking the stand against giving Cameron the backing to actually intervene in Syria, I think it made a clear indication that if we get a Labour government, and I think we will, it will take a much more independent line. It's not just going to be Washington's puppet, which tragically most British governments have.
Maybe, but faced with these three guys on the opposite sides of the bench, the Foreign Secretary, Defence Secretary, and Cameron, they voted for war in Iraq.
When you had the situation of Cameron coming to Parliament saying, I want the backing of Parliament to be prepared to intervene in Syria, to everyone's shock, for the first time in my lifetime, a Labour leader got up and said, we're not giving you a blank cheque to invade. Now, there's massive pressure on Ed Miliband and those around him. American interests are enormous. They know that there'll be hostility if they take an independent line. But I think someone like Ed Miliband, who's actually read a lot about politics, unlike Blair before he became Prime Minister, recognises, you actually look at, say, the record of France under de Gaulle, took a very independent line and actually made him a lot more popular. And I think if you see British Prime Ministers standing up to represent Britain's interests, not just be a cheerleader for the United States, there'll be huge support for that. The public aren't.
You were alive under Harold Wilson in Vietnam, though. Well, Britain didn't go into that one. Miliband is going into Iraq again.
You see, as I was demonstrating on the streets, I was just angry. We weren't sending troops to Vietnam to fight with Ho Chi Minh on side by side. It was outrageous. And if you actually look in President Eisenhower's autobiography, he actually writes, when they split up Vietnam into North and South, he writes there, we had no doubt whatsoever, if there'd been a free election, Ho Chi Minh would have won 80% of the vote.
Cameron is now saying that British troops may have to respond and he may have to tell the House of Commons later. There has been no vote about sending these armed drones into Syrian airspace.
Well, this is the reality.
Miliband doesn't even question this.
Well, no, but this is the reality. We don't have a written constitution. It's not like America. Broadly, a Prime Minister can get away with anything as long as he can just keep that majority in Parliament. And there'll be rumblings. And so he can ignore the views of Parliament. Many Prime Ministers actually have. I think, though, when we get a Labour government, you'll see that it's a government that's actually going to pay some more respect to the opinions of MPs, because it knows public opinion in Britain is overwhelmingly opposed to any more involvement in America's wars in the Middle East. We've just seen hundreds and hundreds of our young men.
Yeah, but we are at war. We're bombing Iraq right now.
And that's wrong. And if I was, the Prime Minister today, we wouldn't be doing anything like that.
But what surprises me, whether one agrees with it or not, is there's not more debate about. And the Ministry of Defence has just been forced to deny on Wednesday, forced to deny reports that Apache helicopters used in Helmand are now going to be used in Iraq.
Part of the reason is we're 6 months from an election. And primarily it's about the economy. And I mean, I would love, because all my life I've been caught up, I mean, my very first demonstration was against America in Vietnam back in about 1965 or something. I mean, all my life I've been obsessed by foreign policy. But if you look at our opinion polls, except when we actually get involved in a war, British public are more concerned about domestic politics, not foreign policy. And whilst I would love to see everybody sitting around their television watching intense debates about foreign policy, that isn't going to happen. The next 6 months are going to be about who can get full employment, who can have a fairer Britain, who's going to make sure the rich pay their taxes and the big corporations do. Foreign policy will barely come into it. It almost never has in any election in my lifetime.
So you personally were the most elected, most popular person in Europe when the mayoralty first came to the capital, as it were. You know a lot about public sentiment. When people are wearing the red poppy, they don't understand that their taxes are going to another war right now, let alone the First World War.
Our media goes along with government foreign policy objectives. And I mean, if I think about it, I mean, throughout my lifetime, I've been involved in all these lefty campaigns about foreign wars, and it engages a small layer of the public. But most people in Britain are just struggling to be able to pay their rent.
So the public just can't get to grips, even in an age of austerity, that some of their taxpayers' money is going into bombs on Iraq.
You've got to remember, 70% of the papers British people read are owned by 5 billionaires. Murdoch, the Barclay brothers, Lord Rothermere, all completely signed up to the American Anglo Alliance, all in line on these issues.
But people didn't think like that for the 2003 war, arguably. People were opposed.
Well, we were very lucky because you had one of the leading figures in the British government, Robin Cook, come out and say, no, this is wrong. You did have a lot of pressure from the media then. A lot of the Tory press was beginning to turn against Tony Blair and looking for him to trip him up. And we were very lucky. But throughout most of the conflicts we've been involved in, any criticism in the media of the British Army is immediately slammed down as being disloyal. And I just think that's nonsense, because usually what our troops have been doing has not been fighting for Britain's interests, but broadly doing what America wants. We've had thousands and thousands of our young men killed fighting for America's economic interests, and this is nonsense.
Well, David Cameron took time out to meet the Emir of Qatar this week. What do you think he should have been saying to him, given the sway of Arab nations on this government's policy?
See, this is the tragedy of the last 30, 40 years. I mean, when we had this growth of extremism in the Muslim world, it was actually broadly funded by the Saudi Arabians and the Americans so that Russia would be dragged into war in Afghanistan. I mean, if you actually look at the records, the CIA went to see Jimmy Carter in his office in the White House in the summer of '79. They said, if you fund these fundamentalist Muslims, Russia will have to intervene. It will become their Vietnam. And they fell into that trap. But it never seemed to occur to Jimmy Carter that those fanatics might then turn on America. And the Saudi royal family and many of the Gulf states have been funding groups like ISIS and the Islamic State, and now beginning to worry, well, if they do get control, aren't they going to behead us because we're profligate and we debauched the whole concept of Islam?
Yeah, but you were saying that after the 2003 invasion, and yet there was a huge debate in this country whether we should fund the kind of groups that were allied to Al-Qaeda or whatever that is in Syria. So
but this is
why is that voice not being heard? Because even elite media and elites such as the ones that own our newspapers should want this information to come
If I think back, you used to have people like Tony Benn and myself will get up in Parliament and make these statements. They would largely not be reported by much of the media. But Parliament's got less people with that sort of background and detailed knowledge anymore about just the very dodgy things we've been involved in, the very dodgy groups Britain and America funded. Let's remember, when Saddam Hussein came to power, the CIA and our intelligence service, MI6, gave him lists of communists and trade unionists that he should kill so that there'd be no threat to Western economic interests. I mean, most of these ghastly regimes at some time or other have been puppets of Western interests.
Yeah, but there's nothing that David Cameron, Michael Fallon and Phil Hammond are getting out of this. I mean, what?
Oh, no, they'll get a lot. When they retire, they'll be stuck on the boards of American corporations. They'll get very nice and substantial incomes. Tony Blair's worth now, we don't know who to believe, 20 million, 50 million, 60 million. I mean, most of it coming from American corporations, because in those vital
You really
10 years,
think, I mean, what you just said there is servicemen and women are being sent at the risk of their own lives so that they can get
They get their
in the
reward.
future non-executive directorships.
They get their reward for serving America's interests, and everyone coming up through the political system knows this. If you pose a threat to America's interests, you might be destabilised, there might be a smear campaign, or you might even have a nasty accident. I mean, an awful lot of people who challenged America's interests seem to die.
And why then is the front bench of the Labour Party right now not calling for an international peace conference?
You cannot allow this Islamic state to exist and spread.
So should we ally with Hezbollah in Iran and Russia?
Yeah, you need to have an alliance which is not seen as just another stooge of the West. That means, I mean, Russia must be a key player in it, Iran should be key players in it. And the real problem, of course, for America is that they've been having this virulent campaign about Ukraine and what's been happening in eastern Ukraine. And it's very difficult then to turn around and say to Putin, well, we need your help to deal with a real evil. It's something that really is a threat to the world.
But if Labour is the next government, as you think it might be, will there be any change then?
I mean, for the first time since the death of John Smith over 20 years ago, we got a Labour leader with the confidence to say no if he thinks things are genuinely wrong. And that's why he stood up and wouldn't support Cameron having the powers to send or to get involved militarily in Syria. And what we've got to do, people, progressives like myself outside, is make sure there's that support. Come on programmes like this so people can see and know what the truth is, rather than what Murdoch tells them in The Sun.
Ken Livingstone, thank you.
Thank you.